Breaking news out of Ottawa over the past 48 hours has produced one of the most striking diplomatic reversals in modern North American trade history. After weeks of aggressive tariff threats and hardline trade rhetoric, the Trump administration quietly reached out to Canada requesting emergency aluminum supplies in an effort to prevent a looming manufacturing crisis across the American industrial heartland. Canada's response came from Prime Minister Mark Carney, recently appointed to oversee the U.S. trade relationship, and it was as brief as it was decisive. One word: no. No conditions, no negotiations, no diplomatic softening. That two-letter response has since ricocheted through boardrooms, factory floors, and political offices, from Detroit to Washington to Beijing. What followed exposed how quickly a posture of economic leverage collapsed into a position of urgent dependence. Over the next several minutes, this story explains how the United States went from threatening punitive tariffs on Canadian aluminum to desperately requesting Canadian help, what specific supply chain failure triggered that emergency outreach, and why Canada's refusal signals a meaningful shift in economic power dynamics in North America. It also examines which U.S. industries are already facing slowdowns or shutdowns, what this means for broader trade strategy, and why analysts say this episode may reshape North American manufacturing for years to come. The key question is how a position of apparent strength unraveled so quickly into a crisis. The timeline is critical. On February 12, 2025, Donald Trump announced via Truth Social that the United States would impose a 25% tariff on Canadian aluminum imports, effective March 1st, arguing that Canadian producers were flooding the U.S. market and threatening domestic production. The announcement sent shockwaves through manufacturing sectors in both countries. 16 days later, on February 28th, the U.S. Department of Commerce quietly contacted Canadian trade officials through back channels requesting emergency exemptions for specific aluminum grades essential to aerospace and automotive manufacturing. That request was declined. On March 8th, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick personally called Canada's trade minister, seeking a 90-day grace period. That effort also failed. Then on March 15th, according to officials cited by Bloomberg, President Trump authorized direct communication with Prime Minister Carney himself. The request was straightforward and urgent. The United States needed immediate access to 47,000 metric tons of high-purity aluminum for defense and aerospace contracts, with delivery required by April 15th. Without it, multiple programs would face delays, including F-35 fighter jet components, Boeing 787 fuselages, and electric vehicle battery casings for Ford. That figure represents roughly 8.3% of total monthly U.S. aluminum consumption, and it is not generic aluminum. It is 99.7% purity aerospace-grade material and specialized alloys produced to military specifications by only 3 facilities in North America. 2 of those facilities are in Canada, one in Kitimat, British Columbia, operated by Rio Tinto, and another in Baie-Comeau, Quebec, operated by Alcoa. The only comparable U.S. facility, in Tennessee, is running at roughly 62% capacity due to an ongoing modernization program that will not be completed until mid-2025. By imposing tariffs, the administration effectively restricted access to supply sources American manufacturers rely on for materials with no short-term substitutes. On March 17th, during a press conference in Ottawa, a reporter asked Prime Minister Carney whether Canada would consider exempting critical aluminum grades given the urgent U.S. request. Standing beside Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne, Carney leaned into the microphone and said simply, "No." He paused, then clarified that Canada would not grant exemptions, waivers, or special considerations for products covered under its retaliatory tariff framework, adding that the United States chose this path and could choose a different one by withdrawing its tariffs. The clip was posted by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and quickly went viral, viewed millions of times within hours, and sparking global discussion. Beyond the viral moment, real-world consequences began unfolding almost immediately. Boeing's commercial airplanes division warned suppliers that production of 787 Dreamliner fuselages in South Carolina could be reduced by up to 20% beginning in April if alternative aluminum supplies could not be secured. Workers across the industrial Midwest and Southeast began hearing warnings of temporary layoffs. Alcoa's facility in Massena, New York, announced a 30% production reduction due to shortages of specialty aluminum feedstock normally sourced from Canada. The deeper issue is structural. The North American aluminum industry is deeply integrated, deliberately designed over decades to optimize efficiency. Canada's abundant hydroelectric power makes aluminum smelting viable and environmentally competitive, while U.S. facilities focus on downstream processing and fabrication. This integration represents billions in investment and cannot be quickly unwound. Compounding the problem, reporting indicates the administration did not consult the Department of Defense or major aerospace manufacturers before announcing the tariffs. Pentagon officials later said they learned of the policy through media reports. Technically, aluminum production is capital-intensive and slow to adjust. Certification requirements for aerospace and defense materials prevent quick substitution from other countries. According to U.S. Geological Survey data, the United States imports roughly 60% of its aluminum, with Canada supplying more than half of those imports and nearly 3/4 of aerospace-grade material. Domestic smelters cannot ramp up production quickly due to labor, energy, and infrastructure constraints. The result is a familiar pattern seen during earlier tariff actions. Prices rise, supply tightens, and downstream industries absorb the shock. Stock markets have already reacted. Shares of Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Ford, and General Motors fell sharply in the days following Canada's refusal, wiping out tens of billions in market capitalization. International partners have taken note. The European Union signaled support for Canada's stance, Mexico began coordinating positions quietly, and China used the episode to highlight what it calls U.S. trade unilateralism. Perhaps most damaging is the erosion of trust. The U.S. and Canada share the world's longest undefended border, coordinate defense through NORAD, and conduct nearly $1 trillion in bilateral trade annually. Treating such a partner as an adversary and then seeking emergency assistance carries long-term consequences. Analysts warn that if the impasse continues, manufacturers may permanently relocate investment to jurisdictions with more stable access to inputs. The administration now faces limited options: withdraw the tariffs and negotiate, escalate using emergency authorities likely to face legal challenges, or maintain the current stance and hope Canada reverses course. Each carries political and economic costs. The broader lesson is clear. Trade policy conducted without careful analysis of supply chain dependencies can backfire quickly. When deeply integrated partners are targeted without understanding mutual reliance, the result is not leverage, but exposure. Canada's refusal did not create this crisis. It revealed it. What happens next will help define the future of North American trade and manufacturing for a generation. The consequences of this standoff are no longer theoretical. They are moving quickly from boardroom warnings to real-world economic damage. As April approaches, manufacturers across the United States are confronting the reality that aluminum shortages are not a future risk. They are an immediate operational threat. Aerospace, automotive, and defense suppliers operate on just-in-time delivery schedules, and even short interruptions ripple outward with speed. Once production lines slow or stop, restarting them is expensive, time-consuming, and often permanent in its downstream effects. According to internal planning documents obtained by industry analysts, several Tier 1 aerospace suppliers are already preparing contingency schedules that assume reduced aluminum availability through at least June. These plans include delayed aircraft deliveries, renegotiation of labor hours, and temporary shutdowns of specialized machining lines that cannot operate without certified material inputs. The defense sector is facing similar pressure. Contractors working on active programs have begun briefing the Pentagon on potential delivery delays tied directly to aluminum sourcing constraints. The uncomfortable reality for policymakers is that this crisis cannot be solved quickly, even if tariffs were reversed tomorrow. Supply chains operate on contracts, logistics pipelines, and regulatory approvals that take months to realign. The damage already done will continue to unfold, regardless of political decisions made in the coming weeks. At the White House, the internal debate has intensified. Economic advisors are warning that sustained disruptions could bleed into the second half of the year, while hardline trade officials argue that backing down would signal weakness. The administration has publicly emphasized the need for long-term industrial independence, but industry experts note that rebuilding U.S. aluminum smelting capacity would take years, not months, and would require massive federal subsidies to offset energy costs. In the meantime, companies are being forced to adapt in ways that may permanently shift investment away from the United States. Several multinational manufacturers have quietly begun evaluating expanded production in Canada and Mexico, where access to aluminum remains stable and predictable. One senior executive at a major automotive supplier described the calculation bluntly, saying that if inputs cannot be reliably sourced in the U.S., future capital investment will follow the materials. Canada's position, meanwhile, has remained unchanged. Prime Minister Mark Carney has framed the response not as retaliation, but as enforcement of predictable trade rules. Canadian officials have emphasized that exemptions would undermine their own tariff framework and weaken their negotiating position, not just with the United States, but globally. That stance has resonated with other U.S. trading partners, many of whom see this dispute as a test case for how smaller allies respond to unilateral pressure. European and Asian governments are watching closely, calculating whether firm resistance can extract concessions without escalation. For American workers, the consequences are increasingly personal. Manufacturing communities that depend on aluminum-intensive industries are already feeling the strain through reduced overtime, delayed shifts, and rising anxiety about layoffs. Economic research consistently shows that uncertainty alone reduces consumer spending, slows local economies, and amplifies financial stress long before job losses become official. Small manufacturers are particularly vulnerable. Unlike large corporations, they lack the balance sheets to absorb sudden cost spikes or prolonged supply disruptions. Many are being forced to choose between raising prices and losing customers, or cutting payroll to survive. These are decisions that permanently alter communities. Politically, pressure is mounting from Congress. Lawmakers from manufacturing states are facing constituents who support domestic industry, but do not support policies that jeopardize their livelihoods. Bipartisan calls for a pause or review of aluminum tariffs are growing louder, as evidence accumulates that the costs are landing primarily on U.S. workers and firms, rather than foreign producers. Public opinion is shifting in parallel. Polling shows increasing skepticism toward trade actions that appear to harm domestic manufacturing in the short term, without a clear path to long-term gains. The larger strategic issue now confronting the United States is credibility. Trade relationships depend not just on power, but on predictability. When policy is announced abruptly, without coordination across defense, commerce, and industry stakeholders, allies begin to hedge. Companies respond by diversifying away from uncertainty. Over time, that erosion of trust becomes more damaging than any single tariff. Analysts warn that if this dispute drags on, it may accelerate a reconfiguration of North American manufacturing geography, with investment flowing toward jurisdictions perceived as more stable partners. That shift would be difficult to reverse, and would carry long-term implications for U.S. competitiveness. The administration's remaining options are narrowing. Withdrawing the tariffs could stabilize supply chains, but would come with political costs. Escalation risks, legal challenges, and deeper diplomatic damage. Maintaining the current course risks compounding economic harm and pushing manufacturers to adapt in ways that permanently reduce U.S. industrial capacity. This episode underscores a fundamental lesson of modern trade policy. In deeply integrated economies, leverage cuts both ways. When dependencies are ignored or misunderstood, policies designed to project strength can instead expose vulnerability. Canada's refusal did not create this imbalance. It revealed it. And as this situation continues to unfold, the decisions made in the coming weeks will shape not only aluminum markets, but the future of North American trade, manufacturing, and economic trust. Part 3 shifts from immediate disruption to the strategic consequences now forming beneath the surface. Because this dispute is no longer just about aluminum, it is becoming a stress test for how the United States exercises economic power in an era of tightly coupled supply chains. Inside the administration, officials are now openly discussing emergency authorities that could bypass normal trade mechanisms. These include invoking national security provisions to compel domestic prioritization of aluminum output and exploring the Defense Production Act as a workaround for supply shortages. But legal scholars and industry experts caution that these tools cannot manufacture capacity that does not exist. They can redirect supply, but only by starving other sectors, effectively shifting the pain rather than resolving it. More importantly, aggressive use of emergency powers risks judicial challenges and further erosion of confidence among allies, who already view this episode as evidence of policy volatility. Behind closed doors, defense officials are increasingly concerned. While public statements have emphasized readiness and resilience, internal assessments reportedly acknowledge that prolonged material shortages could delay maintenance cycles, stretch delivery timelines, and complicate coordination with allied defense programs that rely on shared components. The irony is difficult to miss. A trade action justified on national security grounds is now creating secondary risks for national security itself. From Canada's perspective, this moment represents a rare alignment of economic leverage and political clarity. Prime Minister Mark Carney has made clear that Canada will not absorb the costs of unilateral U.S. policy shifts, particularly when its industries are operating within existing trade agreements. Canadian officials have also quietly accelerated conversations with European and Asian partners about long-term aluminum supply contracts, a move that could permanently redirect output away from U.S. buyers, even if tariffs are eventually lifted. Once those contracts are signed and infrastructure adjusted, reclaiming that supply becomes far more difficult. For multinational firms, the lesson is already being internalized. Risk managers are recalculating exposure to U.S. policy unpredictability, and procurement teams are prioritizing jurisdictions where trade rules change slowly and transparently. This does not happen overnight, but it compounds over time. Capital investment decisions made this year will shape production footprints for decades. Every delayed aircraft, every halted production line, every renegotiated supplier contract feeds into those models. Politically, the administration faces a narrowing window. Early trade actions often rely on shock value, but sustained success depends on follow-through and adaptability. As economic indicators begin reflecting real damage, the messaging challenge grows harder. Claims of strategic patience are difficult to maintain when layoffs and delays become visible. Even supporters of aggressive trade policy are beginning to ask whether this particular fight was chosen without a clear understanding of downstream consequences. Meanwhile, global competitors are watching carefully. China has framed the dispute as evidence that U.S. trade leadership is increasingly erratic, while European officials are privately questioning whether similar unilateral measures could be turned on them in the future. Trust, once weakened, is slow to rebuild. That erosion matters in negotiations far beyond aluminum, affecting cooperation on technology, climate policy, and security. The broader structural reality is that North American manufacturing was built on integration, not isolation. Aluminum flows north to south, components move east to west, and final products cross borders multiple times before reaching consumers. Attempts to reassert dominance through blunt instruments like tariffs collide with that reality quickly and forcefully. What makes this episode particularly consequential is not the policy itself, but what it reveals. It shows how thin the margin for error has become in modern industrial systems, and how quickly leverage can reverse when dependencies are miscalculated. As this standoff continues, the costs will not remain confined to balance sheets or quarterly earnings. They will reshape how companies invest, how allies align, and how credible U.S. trade commitments appear in future negotiations. The aluminum dispute is no longer just a trade fight. It is a signal event, and the signals it is sending are being read far beyond North America.